Harold Mitchell had developed a routine over the past 15 years, ever since his wife Margaret passed away. Every Tuesday and Friday morning at exactly 9:30, he would leave his small flat in Westminster, walk the familiar streets toward Buckingham Palace, and spend a few quiet moments watching the world go by. It wasn't about the tourists or the pageantry. For Harold, those walks represented something deeper, a connection to a London he had helped defend more than 8 decades ago. At 82 years old, Harold moved slower than he once did. His left leg bore the lasting reminder of shrapnel from the Battle of Normandy, a souvenir that made him favor his right side when walking. His hands, weathered and marked with age spots, still carried the calluses from years of working as a carpenter after the war. But his mind remained sharp, and his eyes still held the clarity of someone who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. This particular Friday morning in October carried a chill that reminded Harold of those early dawn hours in France, waiting for orders that would change everything. He pulled his worn wool coat tighter around his shoulders and adjusted the small poppy pin on his lapel, not because it was November, but because he wore it every day in memory of friends who never made it home. The streets around Buckingham Palace buzzed with their usual energy. Tour groups clustered around their guides, phones held high to capture every moment. Street performers entertained small crowds, their music mixing with the sounds of traffic and conversation in a dozen different languages. Harold found a bench across from the palace gates, the same spot he had claimed countless times before, and settled in to watch the changing of the guard ceremony that would begin in about an hour. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small thermos of tea, still warm from his morning preparation. Margaret used to tease him about his precise timing with everything: tea at 7, breakfast at 7:15, morning walk at 9:30. "You could set Big Ben by Harold Mitchell," she would say with that smile that had captured his heart in 1945. Now, maintaining that routine felt like keeping a piece of her alive. As Harold unscrewed the thermos cap, he noticed a young mother struggling with a stroller while her toddler pulled in the opposite direction toward the palace railings. Without thinking, he stood up and approached her. "Need a hand, love?" Harold asked, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had raised 3 children of his own. The woman looked up, grateful but surprised. "Oh, that's very kind of you. Tommy here seems to think he can climb the palace gates." Harold chuckled and knelt down to the boy's level, his old knees protesting slightly. "Tommy, is it? Well, Tommy, those guards up there are very important people doing very important work. We have to let them concentrate, don't we?" The little boy, no more than 3 years old, stopped pulling and stared at Harold with wide eyes. There was something about the old man's calm presence that immediately commanded attention. "Are you a soldier?" Tommy asked, pointing at the poppy pin. "I was, a long time ago," Harold replied. "Long before you were born, even before your mummy was born. Did you fight bad guys?" Harold's expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes we have to stand up to bullies, Tommy. But the most important thing is to be kind to good people and protect those who need protecting." The mother smiled warmly at Harold. "Thank you so much. I'm Sarah, by the way. And this little escape artist is indeed Tommy." "Harold Mitchell," he replied, tipping an imaginary cap. "Pleasure to meet you both." As Sarah managed to wrangle Tommy back into his stroller and continued on their way, Harold returned to his bench. These small interactions had become some of his favorite parts of these morning walks. London had changed dramatically since his youth, but the fundamental kindness of people remained constant. It was something he had fought to preserve, something that made these peaceful moments possible. The morning crowd continued to grow as the ceremony time approached. Harold watched with quiet amusement as tourists jockeyed for the best photo positions, their excitement infectious even if their understanding of the tradition was limited. A group of American teenagers posed dramatically in front of the gates, while their chaperones snapped pictures. An elderly Japanese couple consulted a guidebook, pointing at various architectural features and nodding appreciatively. Harold checked his pocket watch, a gift from his father before shipping out to France. 10:15. The guards would begin their formal approach in about 30 minutes. He had witnessed this ceremony hundreds of times, but it never lost its meaning for him. These young men and women carrying on a tradition that stretched back centuries, maintaining standards of discipline and honor that Harold deeply respected. A commotion near the Victoria Memorial caught his attention. A street vendor was arguing with someone, voices rising above the general noise of the crowd. Harold couldn't make out the words, but the body language suggested trouble brewing. He had developed an instinct for reading situations during his years in the service, and something about this felt different from the usual tourist disagreements or minor complaints. The vendor, a middle-aged Bangladeshi man who Harold had seen working this corner for several years, appeared to be backing away from someone. Harold could see genuine fear in the man's posture. The person confronting him was blocked from Harold's view by the growing crowd, but the aggressive stance was unmistakable. Harold's training kicked in, that old soldier's awareness that had saved his life more than once during the war. He rose from his bench and began walking toward the disturbance, his pace measured but determined. At his age, he couldn't move quickly, but he could still move with purpose. As he got closer, Harold could hear fragments of the argument. The aggressor was using language that made Harold's jaw clench, racial slurs mixed with threats, the kind of poisonous words that revealed the speaker's character more clearly than any introduction could. The vendor was trying to de-escalate, speaking in calm, respectful tones, but his tormentor seemed determined to cause trouble. "Please, sir, I am just trying to work," the vendor said, his accent thick but his English clear. "I have permit, I cause no trouble for anyone." "I don't care about your bloody permit," came the harsh reply. "You people need to learn your place in this country." Harold's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had heard these same sentiments during his youth, watched how hatred could poison communities and turn neighbors against each other. It was exactly the kind of thinking he and his generation had fought to defeat in Europe all those years ago. The crowd around the vendor seemed unsure how to react. Some people pulled out phones to record, others looked around nervously as if hoping someone else would intervene. A few began to walk away, unwilling to get involved in what was clearly becoming an ugly situation. Harold continued his approach, his mind already working through the possibilities. He wasn't the young soldier he had once been, but he still understood right from wrong, and he still believed in standing up for those who needed defending. The vendor reminded him of Allied soldiers he had served with, men from different countries and backgrounds who had proven their courage and character when it mattered most. As Harold drew within 20 feet of the confrontation, he got his first clear look at the aggressor. The man was in his 30s, well-dressed but disheveled, with the red-faced appearance of someone who had been drinking despite the early hour. His expensive suit and confident posture suggested someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. But it was what happened next that transformed this from a simple confrontation into something much more significant. The aggressive man, perhaps frustrated by the vendor's refusal to be cowed, suddenly shoved the smaller man backward. The vendor stumbled, barely maintaining his balance as his cart of souvenirs scattered across the pavement. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people began actively filming now that the situation had turned physical. Harold felt his old military instincts surge forward, that protective anger he had channeled so effectively during the war. But before he could take another step forward, the aggressor made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to harass the vendor, the man's attention shifted. His eyes swept the crowd, looking for easier prey, someone who wouldn't fight back or cause him trouble. His gaze landed on Harold, standing quietly at the edge of the circle that had formed around the incident. To the bully's eyes, Harold must have looked perfect, elderly, alone, moving slowly, clearly not a physical threat. An easy target for someone looking to demonstrate power without risk. The man's expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like pleasure as he focused on this new opportunity. "What are you looking at, old man?" the aggressor called out, his voice carrying across the space between them. Harold stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged. He had learned long ago that showing fear or backing down only encouraged bullies. But he also knew that his next actions would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the safety of everyone around him. The vendor, still gathering his scattered merchandise, looked up with concern. "Please, no more trouble," he said quietly, but his words were lost in the growing tension of the moment. The well-dressed man began walking toward Harold with the confident swagger of someone who believed he held all the power in the situation. The crowd shifted nervously, some backing away to give the confrontation room, others moving closer to get better footage for their social media accounts. Harold remained motionless, his hands hanging calmly at his sides, his breathing steady and controlled. In his mind, he was already calculating distances, angles, and possibilities. The old training never really left, it just waited patiently for the moment when it might be needed again. What the approaching bully didn't know was that Harold Mitchell had faced far more dangerous men than him. What he didn't realize was that the quiet elderly gentleman standing before him had once held a line against an entire German platoon for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. What he couldn't possibly understand was that respect was something Harold had earned through blood and sacrifice, not something that could be taken away by a loud voice and empty threats. And what none of them knew, not the bully, not Harold, not the gathering crowd, was that standing just 30 feet away, partially concealed by the growing mass of onlookers, was a member of the Queen's Guard who had been on his way to begin his shift at the palace gates. The distance between the approaching bully and Harold Mitchell seemed to shrink in slow motion, each step creating a heavier atmosphere of tension that spread through the growing crowd like ripples in still water. Harold could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once kept him alive in foxholes and bombed-out buildings, but now it came tempered with the wisdom of 8 decades of life experience. Marcus Webb, the 34-year-old investment banker who had started this confrontation, felt the intoxicating rush of power that came from intimidating those he perceived as weak. His expensive Italian leather shoes clicked against the pavement with each step, a sound that had once announced his arrival in boardrooms where his aggressive tactics had earned him both wealth and enemies. This morning, after a night of drinking away the memory of being fired for harassment complaints, Marcus was looking for someone to blame for his problems, someone to take his anger out on. The vendor, Ahmed Hassan, watched the scene unfold with growing dread. In his 15 years of working the streets around Buckingham Palace, he had seen his share of confrontations, but something about this felt different. The elderly man standing so calmly in the face of obvious threat reminded Ahmed of his own grandfather, who had told stories of standing up to bullies during his youth in Bangladesh. But Ahmed also knew how quickly these situations could turn dangerous, and he felt responsible for bringing this trouble into the morning peace. "I asked you a question, old man," Marcus repeated, his voice louder now, designed to ensure that everyone in the area could hear him establishing dominance. "What are you staring at?" Harold's response was measured and quiet, spoken with the kind of controlled authority that comes from years of commanding respect through actions rather than volume. "I was watching a coward pick on a hard-working man, and now I'm watching him look for easier prey." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had expected stammering, backing down, or frightened apologies. Instead, he was facing someone who spoke with the calm confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. The crowd around them seemed to lean in collectively, sensing that this was not going to unfold as anyone had expected. Among the gathered tourists and locals, phones continued to emerge from pockets and purses. Sarah, the young mother Harold had helped earlier, had returned after hearing the commotion and now stood at the edge of the crowd with Tommy still secured in his stroller. She recognized the elderly gentleman who had been so kind to her son, and her heart raced with concern for his safety. "Did he just call that man a coward?" whispered an American tourist to her husband. "This is about to get ugly," replied a London local who worked in a nearby office building. Marcus's face flushed deeper red, partly from anger and partly from the embarrassment of being called out so directly in front of so many witnesses. His corporate world had taught him that intimidation was about presenting superior force, overwhelming opposition through aggressive display. He was completely unprepared for someone who met his aggression with calm, direct confrontation. "You think you're funny, Grandpa?" Marcus stepped closer, now within arm's reach of Harold. You think because you've got some more metal on your coat that makes you special? Harold glanced down at his poppy pin, then back up to meet Marcus's eyes directly. This isn't a medal, son. It's a reminder of friends who died so that bullies like you could have the freedom to make fools of themselves in public. The crowd's reaction was immediate and audible. Several people gasped, others murmured approval, and the energy shifted noticeably. What had started as a typical confrontation between an aggressive drunk and an elderly target was becoming something else entirely, a clash between two completely different sets of values, two different understandings of what strength really meant. Marcus felt control of the situation slipping away from him. In his professional life, when direct intimidation failed, he would escalate to more serious threats, usually involving lawsuits or professional consequences. But this old man seemed completely unmoved by anything he had tried so far. Worse, the crowd was starting to turn against him. He could hear murmurs of disapproval and see people shaking their heads at his behavior. "Listen here, you old fool," Marcus said, raising his voice again and pointing a finger directly at Harold's chest. "I could break you in half without breaking a sweat. Maybe you should mind your own business before you get hurt." It was at this moment that Harold's military training truly revealed itself. Instead of backing away from the pointing finger, he took a small but deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them even further. His posture remained relaxed, but there was something in his eyes that Marcus had never seen before, the look of a man who had faced real danger and emerged victorious, someone for whom a corporate bully represented less threat than a particularly persistent mosquito. "When I was your age," Harold said conversationally, as if discussing the weather, "I knew men who could back up their threats. You're not one of them." The crowd was completely silent now except for the soft sounds of phone cameras recording every word. Ahmed had finished gathering his scattered souvenirs and now stood watching with amazement as this elderly stranger continued to stand his ground against someone half his age and twice his size. What none of them noticed was that another figure had been steadily working his way through the crowd from the direction of the palace gates. Guardsman James Crawford, a 26-year-old member of the Scots Guards, had been walking to his post when he heard the disturbance. Unlike the tourists and casual observers, James recognized immediately what he was witnessing, not just a confrontation, but an attack on someone who represented everything his regiment stood for. James was not yet in his ceremonial red tunic and bearskin hat, but wore the standard duty uniform that allowed him to move freely through the public areas around the palace. His training had taught him to observe situations carefully before acting, to understand all the elements in play before making a decision. As he watched the scene unfold, he could see several things that the crowd couldn't: the subtle way the elderly gentleman held himself that suggested military background, the systematic manner in which the aggressor was escalating his threats, and most importantly, the growing likelihood that this was about to turn physical. Marcus's frustration reached a boiling point. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for someone who refused to be intimidated, who met his aggression with calm confidence, and even seemed to be enjoying the confrontation. His usual tactics of overwhelming force and loud threats were not only failing but were making him look foolish in front of dozens of witnesses. "That's it," Marcus declared, reaching out to grab Harold by the shoulder. "I'm done listening to your mouth, old man." But as his hand moved toward Harold, several things happened simultaneously that would transform this confrontation from a simple case of bullying into a moment that would be talked about for years to come. First, Harold's response was not what anyone expected. Rather than flinching or backing away, he shifted his weight slightly and turned his body at an angle that would have been familiar to anyone with military combat training. His hands remained at his sides, but his positioning suggested someone who was not only prepared for physical contact but welcomed it. Second, Ahmed Hassan, who had been watching with growing concern, suddenly called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sir, please, he is veteran. He fought for this country." This information rippled through the crowd like electricity. Suddenly, the context of the confrontation shifted completely. This wasn't just an elderly man being bullied, this was a war veteran, Someone who had earned the right to walk these streets in peace through service and sacrifice. Third, and most significantly, Guardsman James Crawford had seen enough. Military protocol typically required guards to maintain their posts and avoid involvement in civilian disputes. But James recognized that this situation was different. This was about more than a simple argument between strangers. This was about the fundamental respect owed to those who had served, the same respect that his own uniform represented. As Marcus's hand reached for Harold's shoulder, James stepped forward from the crowd and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of centuries of military tradition. "I think that's quite enough." The voice was calm but carried unmistakable command authority. Marcus froze with his hand still outstretched, unsure where this new challenge was coming from. Harold turned slightly to see who had spoken, and his experienced eye immediately recognized the bearing and manner of a professional soldier. The crowd shifted to look at the newcomer, and several people audibly gasped as they recognized the uniform. Even tourists who might not understand the significance of the Queen's Guard immediately sensed that the dynamic had just changed completely. Marcus found himself facing not one opponent but two, and suddenly, his confidence in the situation evaporated entirely. The elderly man had been intimidating enough with his calm refusal to be bullied, but now there was a uniformed representative of the British military standing between him and his target. "This is none of your business," Marcus said, but his voice lacked the aggressive certainty it had carried moments before. James looked at Marcus with the kind of steady, evaluating gaze that military personnel use when assessing potential threats. Then, he turned to Harold with a slight nod of recognition, one veteran acknowledging another. "Are you all right, sir?" James asked Harold, using the respectful tone that one serviceman uses when addressing a senior veteran. Harold smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "I'm fine, guardsman. Just having a conversation with this young man about manners and respect." The crowd now numbered in the dozens, with more people arriving as word spread that something significant was happening near the palace gates. Phones continued to record from multiple angles, capturing not just the confrontation but the growing support for the elderly veteran and the intervention of the guard. Marcus realized that his simple plan to intimidate an easy target had spiraled completely out of control. Instead of demonstrating his power, he had created a situation where he was outnumbered, outclassed, and increasingly surrounded by hostile witnesses. But his pride and the alcohol still in his system prevented him from simply walking away. "This is ridiculous," Marcus declared, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "I was just having a conversation, and now everyone's acting like I'm some kind of criminal." It was Harold who responded, his voice carrying just enough volume for the entire crowd to hear clearly. "Son, when you threaten violence against someone for standing up to bullying, that makes you exactly the kind of criminal this country doesn't need." The crowd's murmur of approval was unmistakable now. Marcus could see faces in the crowd showing clear disapproval of his behavior, could hear people openly commenting on his actions. What had started as his moment of power had become his public humiliation, and it was being recorded for posterity by dozens of phones. Guardsman James Crawford stood perfectly at attention, his military bearing unmistakable even without his ceremonial uniform. 26 years old and a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, James had joined the Scots Guards not just as a career choice but as a calling to serve something greater than himself. His grandfather had served in the same regiment during World War II, and James had grown up hearing stories about the courage and sacrifice of that generation, stories remarkably similar to what he was witnessing in the elderly gentleman before him. The crowd had swelled to nearly 100 people now, creating a large circle around the confrontation. Word was spreading through the usual channels of modern communication, text messages, social media posts, and the old-fashioned method of people simply calling out to friends and family nearby. The morning's peaceful atmosphere had been completely transformed into something electric with tension and anticipation. Marcus Webb found himself at the center of unwanted attention, his expensive suit now seeming less like armor, and more like a costume that marked him as the villain in an increasingly public drama. The alcohol that had given him confidence an hour earlier now made his thinking fuzzy and his reactions slower. He could sense the crowd's hostility, but couldn't quite grasp how completely the situation had turned against him. "Look," Marcus said, trying a different approach. "This is getting blown out of proportion. I was just trying to have a conversation, and this old man started insulting me." James took a measured step forward, positioning himself slightly between Marcus and Harold. His movement was precise and controlled, the kind of positioning that comes from extensive training in crowd control and threat assessment. "Sir, I've been observing this situation for several minutes. What I witnessed was you harassing a vendor, then threatening physical violence against an elderly gentleman. That's not a conversation, that's assault." The legal terminology hit Marcus like cold water. Assault. The word carried implications that went far beyond the simple public embarrassment he was already experiencing. As someone who worked in finance, Marcus understood that certain types of criminal charges could end his career permanently, even if he avoided conviction. Harold watched this exchange with growing respect for the young guardsman. He recognized the tactical approach, using precise language, controlling positioning, and maintaining calm authority in the face of aggressive opposition. It was exactly the kind of professional competence Harold remembered from his own service days, adapted for civilian situations but rooted in the same principles of duty and protection. Ahmed Hassan had remained close enough to follow the confrontation but far enough away to avoid becoming a target again. As a small business owner who depended on maintaining good relationships with local authorities and the palace security, he was deeply grateful for the intervention but also concerned about any potential backlash. His vendor's permit required him to maintain good standing with local police, and confrontations involving tourists could sometimes result in complications regardless of who was at fault. "Guardsman," Ahmed called out respectfully, "I want to say thank you for helping. This man, he was very aggressive, making threats. The elderly gentleman, he only tried to help when he saw trouble." James nodded acknowledgement to Ahmed while keeping his primary attention on Marcus. "Thank you, sir. Your testimony is noted." The word testimony sent another chill through Marcus's rapidly sobering mind. This wasn't just a street argument anymore, it was becoming an official incident with witnesses, recordings, and now military involvement. His lawyer's instincts, developed through years of corporate negotiations, finally began to override his alcohol-influenced aggression. Wait, Marcus said, raising his hands in a gesture that was meant to be peaceful but came across as desperate. "Nobody said anything about testimony or charges. This is just a misunderstanding between citizens." Harold stepped forward slightly, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. "Young man, the only misunderstanding here is yours. You seem to think that expensive clothes and a loud voice give you the right to threaten people who can't fight back. That's not how we do things in this country." The crowd's murmur of approval was stronger now, with several people openly voicing their support for Harold's words. A group of American tourists had recognized what was happening and began a spontaneous round of applause for the elderly veteran. The sound grew as others joined in, creating a wall of sound that left no doubt about where public opinion stood. Marcus felt the full weight of public judgment falling on him like a physical force. Every face he could see in the crowd showed disapproval, disgust, or contempt. Phone cameras continued to record his every word and movement, creating a permanent record that he was beginning to realize could follow him for years. The investment banking world was surprisingly small, and reputation mattered enormously in maintaining client relationships and career advancement. James could see that the immediate physical threat was de-escalating, but his training told him that humiliated aggressors could become unpredictable when they felt cornered. He maintained his position and spoke with the kind of calm authority that was designed to lower tension while establishing clear boundaries. "Sir, I'm going to suggest that you take this opportunity to leave quietly. The situation has been resolved without anyone getting hurt, and that's the best outcome for everyone involved." It was a face-saving offer, professionally delivered, but Marcus's pride wouldn't let him accept it gracefully. Instead of recognizing the gift he was being offered, he made the decision that would transform his morning embarrassment into a life-changing mistake. "I don't take orders from security guards," Marcus declared loudly, his voice carrying the kind of entitled arrogance that had gotten him fired from his job the previous week. "I'm a British citizen, and I have every right to be here. Nobody can make me leave." The reaction from the crowd was immediate and audible. Several people called out responses that were far less polite than anything Harold or James had said. A woman in the crowd shouted, "Show some respect for your elders." An elderly gentleman with his own military bearing called out, "That's a war hero you're disrespecting, you fool." James's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The offer of a quiet exit had been refused, and the continued disrespect toward Harold was crossing lines that James's training and personal values wouldn't allow him to ignore. "Sir, I'm not security. I'm a member of Her Majesty's Guard, and this gentleman is a veteran who earned the right to walk these streets in peace through his service to this nation." Harold felt a deep satisfaction at hearing those words. It wasn't about personal vindication, it was about the recognition of something larger than individual pride. The young guardsman understood what Harold represented, not just as an individual but as a symbol of sacrifice and service that deserved protection and respect. Furthermore, James continued, his voice carrying the full authority of his position, "Your behavior this morning constitutes public disorder, harassment of a vendor, and threatening behavior toward an elderly citizen. Those are not rights, those are violations of the law." Marcus finally began to grasp the serious trouble he was in. But rather than accepting responsibility or showing any hint of remorse, he made the fatal error of doubling down on his aggression. The combination of alcohol, embarrassment, and fundamental character flaws led him to make a choice that would haunt him for years to come. "You know what?" Marcus said, his voice rising to a shout that carried across the entire area. "I'm tired of this. You want to see threatening behavior? I'll show you threatening behavior." What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the crowd didn't immediately process what they were witnessing. Marcus, driven by wounded pride and impaired judgment, drew back his right hand and swung directly at Harold's face. But Harold Mitchell hadn't survived the war, raised 3 children, and lived through 82 years by being an easy target for bullies. His reaction was instantaneous, and came from decades of trained muscle memory that had never really faded. Harold sidestepped the clumsy punch with surprising agility, and Marcus's momentum carried him stumbling forward. As he tried to regain his balance, Harold simply stuck out his foot, sending Marcus sprawling onto the pavement in front of the palace gates with a crash that could be heard across the entire gathering. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, and laughter filled the air as dozens of phones captured Marcus lying face down on the ground, his expensive suit torn and dirty, his dignity completely shattered. What had started as his attempt to demonstrate power had ended with him literally flat on his face in front of the most famous palace in the world. James moved immediately to secure the situation, positioning himself over Marcus while speaking into a radio he had produced from his uniform. "Control, this is Crawford. I need Metropolitan Police response to the Victoria Memorial area. We have an assault on an elderly veteran and a public order situation that requires immediate attention." Harold stood calmly over Marcus, not breathing hard despite the confrontation. He looked down at the man who had tried to attack him and spoke in the same measured tone he had maintained throughout the entire incident. "Young man, you just learned an important lesson about the difference between picking on people you think can't defend themselves and picking on people who actually can't defend themselves. I suggest you remember it." The crowd's cheering reached a crescendo as they realized what they had just witnessed, not just an elderly man defending himself, but a perfect demonstration of how courage, preparation, and dignity could triumph over aggression and bullying. Marcus lay on the ground, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. Assault charges, public humiliation, viral video footage, and now the certain arrival of police who would have to arrest him in front of hundreds of witnesses. His career, his reputation, and his future had just been destroyed in less than 10 minutes by a man old enough to be his grandfather. But the story was far from over. As James had called for backup and the crowd continued celebrating Harold's decisive victory, none of them knew that the Metropolitan Police response would include far more than just a simple arrest. The incident was about to take on dimensions that would surprise everyone involved and turn Harold Mitchell from a local hero into a national symbol. The Metropolitan Police arrived with surprising speed, their response time helped by the proximity to Buckingham Palace and the priority given to any incidents involving the Queen's Guard. 3 patrol cars and a police van converged on the Victoria Memorial area, their blue lights creating a strobing backdrop to the scene that was still unfolding. Sergeant Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of the Met, took charge of the situation with the kind of calm professionalism that comes from handling thousands of similar incidents throughout London. Marcus Webb remained on the ground where Harold's defensive maneuver had left him, his expensive suit now bearing the stains and tears that would serve as physical reminders of his humiliation. As he slowly got to his feet, he found himself facing not just the immediate consequences of his actions but the growing realization that his life had just taken a dramatically negative turn. Harold stood quietly to one side, still calm and composed despite having just been physically attacked by someone half his age. His breathing was steady, his posture relaxed, and his expression showed no signs of the adrenaline rush that would have overwhelmed most people in similar circumstances. To the police officers and paramedics who were beginning to assess the situation, Harold appeared to be in better physical condition than his much younger attacker. The crowd had grown to nearly 200 people now, with new arrivals continuing to stream in as word spread through social media about the incident. The footage that had been captured on dozens of phones was already making its way onto various platforms, with picture this: you're walking down a busy London street on a crisp autumn morning. Tourists snap photos, street vendors call out their wares, and life moves at its usual pace. Then, suddenly, everything stops. A crowd forms. Voices rise. Someone's in trouble. What you're about to hear isn't just another story about bullying or heroism. It's about the moment when past and present collide, when honor meets dishonor, and when the universe delivers justice in the most unexpected way possible. This is the true story of Harold Mitchell, an 82-year-old World War II veteran who thought he was just taking a quiet morning walk. He had no idea he was about to become the center of a confrontation that would be captured on dozens of phones, shared millions of times online, and remind the world that respect isn't just given, it's earned, and sometimes, it's defended by the most unlikely heroes. What happened next in those few minutes outside Buckingham Palace would change not just Harold's day, but his entire life. And it all started with one man's terrible decision to pick on someone he thought couldn't fight back. But Harold Mitchell wasn't alone that day. Standing just 20 feet away was someone trained to protect, someone who had sworn an oath, someone who understood exactly what that elderly man represented. Are you ready to hear what happens when disrespect meets duty, when cowardice faces courage, and when instant karma arrives wearing a bearskin hat? This is that story.